Hi, good evening. I'm Kara Terrell, and I'd like you to join us while we discuss the EPA's proposed plan to clean up the Nyanza waste dump in Ashland, Massachusetts. I just wanted to introduce myself as a member of Ashland Citizens Action Committee, and I'm joined by Danny Borelli, also a member, Michelle Brooks, and Caitlin Terrell. So we're going to go a little bit into the background of Nyanza, and we're going to talk about, where this started and when this started. Then we're going to really discuss the pros and cons of the proposal from EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Environmental Protection. And I'm going to have Caitlin start and just discuss when and where this all started.
So as most people in Ashland are probably familiar with Nyanza, it was a chemical dye company started in 1917, and it was under several different names for about 60 years. And it later became one of the first 10 of the EPA's Superfund programs in 1982. Ever since, it's been a source of concern for residents of Ashland, and eventually in 2006, the DPH finally confirmed what the residents had always been suspicious of, that Nyanza caused an elevated risk of cancer and even sometimes death. So since 1987, the EPA has addressed remediation throughout their initial cleanup, which was a while ago, and then 4 long-term phases of cleanup focusing on soil, off-site groundwater, wetlands, drainage ways, and the Sudbury River.
Thank you. I think it's also important to share that all of us grew up in Ashland. There's more members in the Ashland Citizens Action Committee who are also supportive and have been in the fight for the long haul for at least the last 4 years since we became involved. And I just wanted to tell people a little bit about our involvement and the push and the joining in forces with the local, state, and federal government. So Michelle, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Ashland Citizens Action Committee started back in 2016 out of concerns about new developments coming up in the Ashland community and the potential impacts on the Nyanza pollution and the cap site in particular. Then sort of evolved into this growing of new knowledge and concern around remaining contamination in town and what we could really do to band together and work to get the town fully cleaned up. And so the goal was really to ensure that remediation was completed to the satisfaction of the residents of the community and the general sense of well-being and safety for our families and for our children. And so throughout the course of this group, we've worked really closely with local officials here in town, with the EPA and with the State Department of Environmental Protection to do various efforts to raise awareness and just more generalized scrutiny into the feasibility study that was being done by the EPA and how we could have an influence in that. And also there was some bylaws that we worked on around protection as well.
Yeah, I think that's important to know that this group, the board that we created, and along with the town administration, we really were involved in pushing for this feasibility study. So this is something that our group has pushed for when we realized there is more work to be done, which has actually become our hashtag or our byline now. We also pushed for significant bylaws to be included and that board awareness. We actually had someone from board years ago say, I didn't think about Nyanza. Well, we want that to be in the forefront of most people's minds, because for people that grew up during this time, and I think for past residents and future residents, I think we all need to think about the safety and the health of people. And we really wanted this to become a reality. So I think we should, we're pretty excited that the EPA has come back and presented this this proposal. And people get it online, and we'll get people information later. But I just wanted to also speak to, they have a criteria for choosing the cleanup plan. And they had a forum a couple months ago that we attended, and I think if Caitlin, you could just talk about the criteria that was required and what they're looking for, and subsequently what we're looking for.
So the EPA uses 9 criteria to evaluate the cleanup alternatives and select a final cleanup plan. They have already evaluated how well each of the cleanup alternatives developed for the Nyanza Chemical Waste Dump Superfund site meet the first 7 criteria in the feasibility study. So number 1 is overall protection, so that includes human health and environment. Number 2, compliance with applicable or relevant and appropriate requirements, so that's called ARARs. Does the alternative meet all federal environment and state environmental and facilities citing statutes and regulations that are applicable? 3 is long-term effectiveness and permanence. 4, reduction of toxicity, mobility, or volume through treatment. 5, short-term effectiveness. Could the cleanup cause short-term hazards to workers, which was definitely a concern of ours when we were pushing this for the EPA, workers, residents, or environment, especially people who live in that area. 6, implementability. Is the alternative technically feasible? 7, cost. What's the total cost of an alternative over time? 8, state acceptance. Do state environmental agencies agree with EPA's proposal? And 9, community acceptance.
Yeah, I think that those things are important, and that's what EPA is saying that they've looked at and that this plan meets. They actually proposed, I think it was, Danny, about 5 plans. So they presented 5 plans, and their determination was that the 4th plan was the most viable for Ashland and the most cost-effective and the most likely to be able to be completed as well. So that was another piece. I just want to let everybody know also that the EPA will be accepting public comments on the proposed cleanup plan until the end of March. So everybody can contribute to that, and they will be talking about alternatives, looking at wetlands and protecting the floodplain resources. And we'll put that information up at the end as well.
And comments can be made to the EPA through mail, email, or fax.
Yeah. Or anybody can just send it to us and we can convey it to them as well.
Yeah.
I think we know why cleanup is necessary, but I just want to give a little overview of why the Environmental Protection Agency is telling us that this cleanup is valid. There's both current and future potential threats to human health at the site due to historic chemical and waste storage and disposal practices from the former dye manufacturing operations. So we're going to start talking about some, words that are used quite often. So I'm gonna defer to Danny. We're talking about the presence of DNAPL. Danny, would you share with everybody what that is?
Yeah. So the EPA and a lot of government agencies use a lot of acronyms. So in the language
They love acronyms.
So for the EPA, DNAPL stands for dense non-aqueous phase liquid. It's a fancy word. Think of it as a sludge, right? In each particular Superfund site, and there are over 1,600 now, have their own unique kind of sort of blend of chemicals that are found at that site. So instead of referring to each one as a conglomerate of all of the toxins found at the site, they call it a DNAPL.
Right. Just a toxic chemical mix of sludge. And now, is this solid or is it liquid?
It is technically a liquid that is heavier than water, so it displaces water. In the case of Ashland and Nyanza in particular, there's over 100 different source chemicals that were attributed to that site.
And in comparison, I think the Love Canal was a famous or infamous site as well. How many chemicals did they have?
Between 30 and 40.
So we've surpassed that at least 3 times.
Correct. And it also makes it more challenging to trace the public health impact. 100 different chemicals across a community will will manifest differently than a larger quantity of a smaller number of chemicals. They'll produce a smaller set of effects.
Like if you just had mercury, or if you just had one type of poisoning, it would be easier
Arsenic,
to trace.
Yeah, so a civil action in Woburn was a tannery. It had a very small set, but of chemicals, but a very large quantity of that
Right.
set. So it produced a specific strain that was more visible to public health officials earlier than the cancers in Ashland.
And I think what EPA goes on to say is that one of the other reasons that this is so damaging to the town is that it got it immediately into the groundwater. And once it gets into the groundwater, it had gone down 10 miles in the Sudbury River. Now, at that point, the contamination is spread out. It goes into the wastewater. There was a vault, a concrete vault, into a famously named brook, named Chemical Brook, in Ashland, and through other drainage ways to the Sudbury River. And then a lot of the waste and sludge was buried into the ground, which causes the groundwater infiltration, which can, subsequently got into the water and got into, that's where kids were playing or had access to it. At this time, we're not, and the EPA and the DEP and town officials and our group are all firmly believe that there's no immediate risk to anybody from any contamination. But that doesn't mean that this doesn't have to be cleaned up, and that's what we're really here for. So another piece is that the residual DNAPL, which is that sludge that we talked about in the Nyakol, which is another business. So originally it was Nyanza, and then it became Nyakol. And it acts as an ongoing source of groundwater VOC contamination. Now, I know that VOC means volcanic organic compound, but I'm going to have Danny actually explain what that means,
Yeah,
because he's our expert.
Volatile organic compounds. So that's when something like a DNAPL converts into a gas, right? And then what you're trying to do in a site like this is contain human exposure or pathways of exposure. So right now there's, by saying it's in the contaminated groundwater plume, is there a potential argument that that is a containment system? The counter argument in the case of Ashland is they have found it is turning into VOCs into gas form and traveling up through the soil into structures above the contaminated groundwater plume.
People's homes.
Yeah, and then necessitating the intervention of vapor mitigation systems.
Which we'll get to in a little bit. I think what's important too is that there have been prior cleanup actions in the 90s and early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
There was significant intervention, there was significant funding sourced, because what had happened to determine that the cancer was related to Nyanza was that a lot of us participated, older ones participated in a health study done, which was pushed by a family in town whose son, the Kane family, whose son was sick with cancer, and they really wanted to find out what's going on, because there were other boys in my class and other classes in the high school that were also getting sick with very rare cancers. So when we did the health study, that took about 8 years, I believe.
Yeah.
And
1998 to 2006.
yeah.
So that was gathering as much health documentation as possible, getting information from doctors, getting diagnosis from people. And at that time, it was very rare for the EPA to actually conclude that this was directly related to a chemical site. But that is what happened, and therefore then the funding could be directed to the cleanup. So there was a cleanup before in the history of Ashland. It just wasn't completed. And when our group got involved a couple years ago about concern about a development impacting the site, we learned a little bit more about the sites, that still have active contamination. Ashland is still a current Superfund site, is an active Superfund site. So there were elevated levels of chlorinated ethene, such as trichloroethene, TCE, and chlorinated benzene compounds have been identified in the overburden and bedrock aquifer groundwater. So basically, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, what that means is that these were some of the main chemicals that were dumped, and that's what they're seeing in the groundwater. And in the subsequent, in that area, the ground rocks and fissures, it's appearing in those areas.
Yes, and I mean, it's hard for people who live in a place to also kind of step back from the place and analyze it. So what's happening is that the chemicals were dumped on a hill, Magunko Hill, and that hill kind of slopes down into a swampy condition that goes into the Sudbury River, right? And the contaminated groundwater plume basically rides that directionality. So if you're looking at a map, and you're looking at the remediated cap, it's moving northwest into the Sudbury.
Into the river. So that's what it talks about, that there has been some cleanup, but it wasn't completed. And properties that are located right now in the current vapor mitigation area have been provided with, or given the opportunity to be provided with, a vapor mitigation system to eliminate the short-term risks. However, these were voluntary for residents and businesses and did not address the source of contamination and do not meet a statutory preference to attain a permanent solution to the contamination. So can you speak a little bit about the vapor mitigation systems that some people possibly on Pleasant Street will have in their house if they went down in the basement, what they would find?
So the way in which it works is if you look at your structure from above, so we'll say a home, and you go off of that structure about a foot or 2 feet and you go down, what the EPA did was they put in a perforated piece of PVC off of that structure and down, right? And then it's attached to a vertical, now we're gonna look at the house from the side, it's attached to a vertical set of PVC that goes out to a filtration system, then above the roof line, right? So a lot of people know about these as radon systems.
Right.
Right.
Okay, it's the same exact setup, same functionality. The importance of putting it in some of the structures in Ashland is that they're old structures, so they're very permeable fieldstone foundations. So the gas is getting in easier, and what it is not is an active communicative system. That would be a system that has a threshold in it, like a carbon monoxide inside your home. It says, there are X parts per million. When my system hits this, that's unhealthy for humans, and I will communicate to you.
Right.
So
You'd hear a buzzing or an alarm. And these aren't those. That does not.
It's a passive
give you
system,
that.
so we don't know.
So it's not monitored.
Right.
But we don't
Unless you-
know if
Call
a
EPA.
certain structure has a filter that is receiving a lot more gas or VOCs than ones on either side of it. It's a very simple system.
And that's part of what the proposed resolution and plan is. It's to reduce the dissolved phase VOC concentrations to levels such that they're so shallow, groundwater exposure risk is diminished, and VMSs are not required in new or existing buildings in the contaminated groundwater plume. Can you talk a little bit about the plume and where that is?
So the plume is what the EPA refers to as a operable unit 2, right? So I'm going to segue
Yeah.
a little bit into how the EPA looks at Ashland, and in particular the way in which in a map it's looking at the various both kind of physical soil but also wet kind of swampy areas. So the remediated cap that we all can kind of physically see, that's operable unit 1. Immediately to the east and the west of that are a series of wetlands, that's operable unit 3. Both of those were remediated first in the late 1980s with the cap, and then the dredging and a reconstruction of the wetlands in the late 90s. Late 80s, early 90s. Operable Unit 3, Operable Unit 2 is a contaminated groundwater plume. So that is the DNAPL that's under the town.
Again, that's the sludge.
That's the sludge.
But this is, I think what's important to note, and we all have talked about the capped landfill, which is 50,000 tons of DNAPL, which is devoid of any water. So it's a physical place where this stuff is stored, where it's not going to leach. We believe it's not going to leach. EPA believes it's not going to leach out into the groundwater. But what you're talking about is the plume, and that's ever changing, and there still has the movement in there. So that is one concern, that if there's a disruption to that area, or there's a movement of this plume that's underground at the end of Pleasant Street, then what happens?
Right, it could trigger a release.
Right.
So when I first started looking at this as a master's project at Harvard in 2010, and was in contact with scientists through a project at MIT, and I went into a speculative space where I said, well, what happens to a site like this if it gets flooded? Then I looked up FEMA flood maps, and sure enough, because of the presence of the river and the swampiness that we talked about earlier, that zone is in a high-risk flood zone. And as we've seen, there's been an increase in 100 to 500-year flood events in the last 10 years.
Right, they're happening all the time
More
now.
frequently, right? So what I was told by a scientist at National Oceanic Atmospheric Institute, NOAA, is that if you flooded a site like this, and you're already having VOCs come up through the soil, that with a contaminated groundwater plume of DNAPL, gas, soil, you add water on top, it's going to help the gas come up faster. So, to your point about the vapor mitigation systems, it's not a remediation method. It's a diversion. It's just moving the gas away from the homes.
Okay.
So if we do nothing in Ashland, what this new document by the EPA is saying is that it will take 600 years to just slowly off-gas.
Right.
And not everybody has the vapor mitigation systems
Yeah.
anyway.
Caitlin, can you
Correct.
speak to
Right.
that, because you did some, on-the-ground research, talking to residents over on Pleasant Street and finding out if they were even aware of this, or knew about it, or if they're renting a property, if they have an awareness of that.
I think that part of the problem with the area that is contaminated is it's a lot of renters, and people are moving in and out and have no idea that this is even in the town. And a lot of people that have moved to the town that are new don't even know that this exists. So the people in the area, they may or may not have a vapor mitigation system. They may not even know they have a vapor mitigation system. And then if somebody is trying to sell the house or buy the house, they may not want anybody to know that this exists. And then also, if you're people that are moving in and out, and we noticed along Pleasant Street, people are fishing and then directly grilling their fish from Mill Pond.
Right.
And that is also contaminated.
And the EPA and DEP have signage that does tell people not to eat the fish.
They do. One concern was that the signage should be in,
Multiple languages.
Spanish, Portuguese, and maybe Russian as well, because that's, also a problem. But, people are just not aware or disregarding signs, or not even seeing them. I don't know.
And that is a problem. Again, this isn't an imminent risk to anyone. This is just an ongoing project that we want people to be aware of and educate themselves about, and that everybody needs to get this information, and we can move forward with some help, but we need residents to be pushing this and to be involved.
Yeah, I think, just to interject on that point, I think that when there is a history that's so traumatic like this for so many people, it's so long ago, and people do not want to talk about it anymore. they
It's hard to
don't
talk
want to
about.
think about it anymore, and they want to think that it's gone. And unfortunately, we've uncovered that it's not gone, and even though it's uncomfortable and upsetting to think about, we still have to do this.
Yeah, it's okay to face something, even if it's a little disturbing or concerning.
Yeah.
And we just don't want anybody else to go through what we've gone through.
Yeah, you can't ignore it.
So I just want to start to think about going over the EPA's cleanup proposal, just a snapshot. We're going to just kind of give an overview of what their proposed remedy is going to be. And then we could kind of talk about, whether we agree with that, what are the pros, what are the cons, and, where the town administration stands as well. So, basically, they are identifying these additional sources of dense, non-aqueous phase liquid, which is the DNAPL again, sludge. Residual DNAPL is believed to be the source of elevated levels of the VOCs, where the volatile organic compounds detected within the contaminated groundwater plume. So I think what they're saying is that they're recognizing that there is still more, and this is another piece that we need to value about this current EPA plan, is this is updated, 20 years later, updated systems, new science. They have a lot of more information that we're going to, this is going to be valuable to us. So you can just speak to that, and then as also the additional DNAPL recovery to enhance existing extraction efforts.
So currently, there's one extraction location at Worcester Air Conditioning in the back of that property as it sort of abuts the train tracks. And that has been running pretty continuously for about 20 years. And the only analogy I can come up with, because I'm an artist, I'm a visual person, would be like you had a 50-gallon drum of milk and you tipped it over in your kitchen, and to clean it up, you gave someone a straw and told them, you can't move the straw.
We don't use straws anymore, do
But
we?
you can only pull that liquid out at one point.
Right.
Yeah.
So all they've kind of done is like maybe pulled it up out of one location. So part of what they're exploring here in this document is, do we add extra extraction points? Not
Which would-
without straws, with
No
pipes
straws.
and pumps, right? So the one part is more extraction. Another part is called in situ. Where is that?
Chemical
Yeah.
oxidation.
Chemical.
Yeah, chemical oxidation, ISCO.
Yeah.
That's where they would blast down into the actual
bedrock.
plume area. This type of chemical that would basically fasten itself to the DNAPL and make it stay in place. You have to think of the plume not as a passive thing, but very much as an active and alive thing, right? And so part of what I think these different methods, one is to try to pull it out of the ground, the other one is to sort of freeze it in place.
So another piece that I think is additional, and we found out about this when we did some of our investigations, and you can talk about the monitoring wells. So we had a certain amount of monitoring wells since the last cleanup. Then since we got involved and got the EPA and DEP involved again, they actually have added some more in town. Can you just speak to what they are? People
Yeah.
might not recognize them as and know what they're doing.
Okay, so a monitoring well is essentially a steel pipe that's perforating the ground, going down to different depths, right? And they put them at different depths because they're trying to get a sample, a biological sample of what's happening at the bottom of that pipe. And what the EPA is committed to at every Superfund site is a continuing 5-year study where they come out, they drop different devices down these wells, they pull them up, they send them to a lab, and they produce a new map of what is happening at a place like this. In this particular instance, it's below the town, right? We've always questioned, how do you know the perimeter is the perimeter? Are we sure about that? And aren't there other locations that maybe, what happens if you put a monitoring well 50 feet to the right of the perimeter? What do we find? So part of the challenge that I think the Citizens Action Group did was to ask the EPA to come out before their 5-year study and to look even further beyond that existing perimeter.
Yeah, and their feasibility study took about almost 2 years, and to get the results. So the government doesn't always move quickly, as we have found out, but that doesn't mean we don't, we have remained a watchdog group and have really tried to be on that and commit them to the cleanup. And we've been lucky that the town administration and our local reps and Senator who lives in Ashland supports this. And speaking about those type of remediations, they also talk about the land use restrictions. I'm not sure if you know exactly what they're talking about. They can consider these institutional controls as well, and whether that's as effective as we'd like it to be.
Yeah, land use restriction, I mean, in their language, they're calling it an IC, an institutional control. I mean, specifically in the case of Ashland, I think we all, just to make it, say it out loud for the camera, but one thing that we were concerned about was a private citizen putting in a private well. And so that would be an example of a land use restriction where we'd say, well, if you reside or own property within the contaminated groundwater plume, you would have to get EPA approval to dig at depth.
Right.
And certainly
Right.
And that, yeah.
not allow something like a private water well.
Right. And that speaks to some of the work that, after we became involved, we had asked that the town created a Nyanza advisory group. And we had a couple liaisons from our group being in the committee. And one of the things they worked on was the bylaw that required residents within that certain parameter to go before the town and have that looked at before they do any type of digging or implementing that or any change to their water systems. So that's one piece that I believe is already in place. And in addition to these cleanup components and institutional controls to protect the remedy, the overall remedy will continue to include periodic reviews every 5 years, which you spoke to. So this remedy is really about, this remediation is really about addressing operational unit 2.
Correct.
Which doesn't mean that these other operational units don't have still has remaining contamination. And we have to look at that. But looking at this, the operations and maintenance and long-term monitoring, it's estimated to cost approximately $20.5 million and estimated to take approximately 5 to 10 years to design and implement. And when we looked at the different proposals, this is probably the cheapest one, and this is probably the quickest one. Some of the proposals included, 65 years in the future, which means that my great-grandchildren would never see Ashland as a cleaned-up town, which is concerning, but that doesn't
Actually,
mean.
Or
They're
even
mo-
more, 200
It was
years.
175 was the most aggressive.
175 years,
Yeah.
so I can't even think about that.
So there was a bunch of different options, and some of them were if we did nothing at all, as Danny talked about, how long would it take to dissolve out of the plume? Some of them would be just continuing to have existing monitoring wells. Then there was on the table the idea of the in situ oxidization process, which is part of the proposal. But then the other thing that we heard in one of the other proposals, which they're not recommending, is this idea of like a pump and treatment system where they would essentially extract it, put it through a water filtration system, and see what that could do. But I think the EPA had said the reason why they weren't prioritizing this route is based on what they've gotten back from results at other sites where that's been tested, that they didn't see as great of a reduction in the chemicals in the DNAPL as they would hope for I guess partially for the costs of doing that system.
Yeah, that's definitely one part, and the other part, I think the real big issue, what Michelle was just outlining, is the most aggressive proposal on the table by the EPA. If we pursued that, it would take 175 years to achieve a level of clean, right? One of the biggest hurdles in that is not only, it's gonna take some effort and time, but it's a land issue, right? So the pump and treatment plant has to go
Right.
as close and proximal to the source of contamination. And when you look at a map of Ashland,
Where
when you
would
look
we
at that
cite
area,
it?
Downtown,
there's nowhere to put it.
right.
Where would we cite it? Yeah.
Where would we cite it? And I think knowing that, and but that there would potentially have to be either a municipal, a commercial, or a residential entity that would have to give up land in pursuit of that remedy. In their assessment, that was very unlikely. That isn't what happened at other sites. So I think if this was a site in the middle of the woods, that wasn't an issue. They could clear some trees and then put in the pump and treatment system and go, all right, let's see what this does. But
Yeah.
Yeah, and EPA is recommending this plan because it, meets their cleanup objectives or remedial action objections for this site. Whether that coincides with residents' view or what's the best thing for Ashland, we still have to consider that.
And people have different viewpoints. It's something that's being debated amongst community members that we saw at the EPA public hearing that was held last month. Is some people in town, officials, do feel very strongly that we should be going with the most comprehensive and intensive approach to get rid of the remaining contamination. I think part of the sentiment that people have worried about that, in addition to the funding piece, is competition amongst other Superfund sites in the state and in the region, and how likely it would be that we could get this done in the time frame that they would like, and also taking into concern, the federal funding for the EPA being cut with this current political climate and administration. We felt so relieved and gracious that the EPA really has stayed committed to the town and to working with us as advocates in this group, and really trying to keep us up to date and educated with everything that they've been doing in the process. So there's definitely some different viewpoints, and I think those are the main things that it comes down to, is costs and feasibility.
Yeah, and the EPA does believe that this reduces the toxicity, the mobility, and the volume of contaminants. And that's what, Dan, you mentioned, that this is an active site, meaning it's movable, it's could be disrupted at any time. So that's what they believe. It meets the criteria that Caitlin had spoke about before. They think it matches up with a lot of the goals that they have. But I think we still have some unanswered questions. We had questions at the forum, and I think we continue to have questions, and that residents have questions. And again, there's open comment till the end of March, so people can still participate and get involved with this, because this is an important decision. As you know, could be going on for the next 175 years, what we decide. So it's time to get involved. Danny, is there any other piece that you think is important for people to know?
Just to reiterate what we're all saying, which is it's pretty amazing the EPA came back out. We're now firmly in the category of a legacy site, and when you look at it on the surface, everything looks fine. And in fact, I think through a lot of our shared work, we've brought this narrative back to light. I, for one, was surprised to find that there was some toxicity still in the town.
Yeah, I think a lot of us were.
Yeah.
And that when we started doing our outreach, right, we talked to so many people in town, particularly younger folks who had little to no idea. And for me, it was like, I grew up in this town. Don't want to give out my age, but I graduated in 2012 and
just
really
gave your
had
age
heard
out.
nothing, had heard nothing about Nyanza.
Yeah.
Like, what is Nyanza?
And that's another thing that is in our accomplishments is that the schools are now getting information, and we've presented curriculum to the schools to introduce this. And Dan, you had, through your Memorial Garden, had basically allowed students from the middle school to use the setup there for an outside nature class, and to use it to learn about science, to learn about all different things, and including Nyanza. And that's you said a legacy. That's a legacy for the town. It was a collective trauma, but we just still want to keep being involved. And Michelle, why don't you speak to Michael Herbert's blog that he had mentioned some of the ways that how he views this, and how he wants to continue to be involved and have open dialogue with, just not only our group, but the EPA and the DEP. Because that support is really important in moving forward.
Yeah. The town manager, Michael Herbert, did put out a blog post, which I believe is on the town's website and probably Facebook as well, just with his initial reactions and thoughts after having conversations with the EPA about this proposal was, again, why this alternative and not the other one with maybe the more comprehensive approach. And so we talked about some of the reasons why they feel that this is the best option on the table, and just that the willingness on both local government side and the federal and the state government side to work together through this has been critical. He talked about, since 2016, we've put into place informal administrative policies that both protect the health and safety of residents living in the Plume area and in the downtown. We're looking for some more of those informal policies to become institutional controls, which could be a part of the process that they've outlined. It requires more testing to happen, sending those test results to the EPA and incorporating their recommendations into our final plan and local decisions in the community. It also requires specialized detection equipment and health and safety plans for any further construction, and elimination of any irrigation wells within the area. That's certainly one of the biggest concerns, right, is trying to keep a safeguard on people not being exposed to the contaminated groundwater. So I think everybody here in town is really grateful to the EPA for continuing to work with us and be involved and pursue the feasibility study that they did. And the town is excited that they've presented this proposal. And we really want to encourage folks in town to weigh in on the proposal through the public comment period that's been extended.
Thank you.
And should we, if you don't have anything else to add, should we present our big reveal of the?
One of the other things that we have accomplished
Yes.
Yeah.
in town as a...
So this is kind of an exciting piece, and it was proposed a few years ago. We worked closely with the Kane family who lost their son, Kevin. We have another member who had lost her brother. We have close ties to lots of family members and friends who have lost people. And part of the work that Dan did, getting his master's, PhD at Harvard.
You can just say that, they won't.
He mentioned Harvard, MIT,
And Ashland High.
and Ashland High School.
Actually, I'm a public school kid.
You're a public school kid. We all are. And I think it related to his work with the Memorial Garden, where people can go to have a safe place to think about the losses. They can go there for just a beautiful walk into that area. But we're looking forward to this summer that we're going to have, we're going to be letting people know the town had supported our idea, and they had presented it to the select board the other night, and they had approved it, that that formerly known MBTA access road will be now known as Memorial Drive, and that's a real testament to the families who have lost people and the memories that we want to still keep alive.
In memory of our friends.
In memory of our friends and family and people who are still suffering, because
Right.
not everybody has passed away, but they still might be grappling with some horrible disease.
And they really did that on their own initiative. It's not like we demanded or requested it. It was really a response by the town government in appreciation, I think, for what a lot of us have done. And I think it was a very touching gesture.
Yes.
That they
We've been very
initiated that.
supported by
Yeah.
that,
They've
Yeah.
been
which is great.
Yeah, and I just want to, again, we're here to educate people and to give some people some information in layperson terms, because we've got a chance to kind of study these things and talk to the people that are doing this work and become more familiar with it. But do your own research, of course. The Nyanza site is tons of information. There's a room, I think, at the library which has books upon books and the health study, and has all that documentation. We also have a website, and Dan has a website as well, a Nyanza, where the Ashland Citizens Action Committee.org.
And you can always post questions to our Facebook page, too.
Yep, we have a
Yeah.
Facebook page. And this is really about, I want to say again that this is not about any immediate risk to anybody. The water is safe to drink. There's no immediate contamination risk for anybody. So I just wanted to reiterate that as well. We feel safe in our town. We love our community. We want it to continue to be safe, and we do want to clean it up.
Yeah. And please reach out to us if you have questions. At the website, you can find our email or on our Facebook page. As Kara said, we really want to help make this highly technical information and reporting from the EPA as accessible to residents as possible so that they can be informed and weigh in on the decisions in town.
Yes. I'd like to tell residents where they can find some more information. We're at www.ashlandcitizensactioncommittee.org. I also wanted to let people know that there is a Massachusetts Cancer Registry, and you can call 617-624-5662. If you or your family or friends believe that they have cancer that might be related to the Nyanza site. This is important because this is a key reason that we got the original funding after the health study. So if there's enough reports about cancer and they do some research, we might be able to have more federal funding. So this is a piece that's really important.
Yeah, even if you moved away and you lived here 20 years ago, it's important to
Yeah,
report
it's
that.
still relevant.
People might have forgotten that this might be related to that, or you might not know. That's okay. You can still report it.
Yeah, and as far as the key contacts at the EPA, Lisa Thuat is our EPA project manager, 617-918-1129, or you can reach her on her email, Thuot, THUOT .Lisa, Lisa, at EPA.gov. Then we have Zanetta Purnell. She's the EPA Community Involvement person. Her direct line is 617-918-1306, and you can also reach her on her email. It's Purnell, Purnell, Zanetta, Zanetta, at EPA.gov. The Mass DEP project manager is Jennifer McWeeny, and her number is 617-654-6560. Her email address is jennifer.mcweeny, MCWEENEY, at state.ma.us. The website is the epa.gov/superfund/Nyanza. So all that information can be found all on those websites, or you can contact us. I think what's important to know is that the more involvement we have for residents, the more we have support on a local, state, and federal support. Can you just speak about Jack Patrick Lewis and how he's been involved with us, and Karen Spilka?
They've supported and come to most of our events, I think. We had a fundraiser. We had, what did we do at
We
the
had a
corner
tour.
spot? The tour of
The toxic tour.
the toxic. Danny did an event in town that was wonderful, and that had a really good turnout. And you could tour using gel-covered lights throughout town to actually get a feel for the toxins that are at those locations. And it was like a 3D art exhibit, which is, would you describe it as that?
Yeah.
That was a really great event. And it was really nice for families who have been affected to attend that as well. I think that what you touched upon is getting people involved. We all grew up and moved away and are still involved. Kara moved back to Ashland and is involved. So I think people that live here now really need to try to get in touch with us, attend meetings, attend our events, support us if we have fundraisers, get involved that way, because this is your town.
Right. And we do love our community. There's so many great things about the Ashland community. I think what's interesting is, since we grew up, it was, a one-horse town. Maybe it was a little bigger when you went to school, Michelle. But it was a small town. People knew each other. People, supported each other. Everybody was very similar in a lot of ways. There was a socioeconomic, middle-class environment. Everybody was, went to the same church. And now we've seen that those values are something that other people are interested in and want to be involved with. So the things that you loved about Ashland, remember, are the things that we still have to protect and we still have to value. So although we came before you, it doesn't mean that you can't be involved, and everybody's going to be a factor in this cleanup.
Yeah, we welcome new people.
Yep. And so this is Ashland Citizens Action Committee letting you know that there is more work to be done. Thank you.